There was an attempt in Tsarist Russia in the 1890s to put through some reforms. There was sort of an attempt to industrialize and modernize the country, but the Tsar was not willing to give up power and allow Russia to modernize. So we see the growth of a specific style of socialism there, which is having to work within an absolutist state where there is absolutely no parliamentary democracy whatsoever. In Germany, there was sort of parliamentary democracy, but it was a very complex political system where the poorer you were, the less your vote counted for. So it was sort of a proportional representation. And when wealthy people voted in their upper parliament, their votes actually counted for more in this very complex scheme. I won't go into it; it's too confusing. I could explain it, but it'd take about 20 minutes. So it basically meant that the wealthy still controlled the politics in Germany, and it wasn't truly democracy. But at least after 1891, it was legal for socialists to have their own political parties and to run for elections and to elect representatives to the Reichstag, to the German parliament. That was not the case in Russia at all. The socialist movement in Russia was absolutely under the repression of the Russian Tsar, infiltrated, persecuted by the secret police, imprisoned. So they developed a specific sort of underground style of socialism, which, as we'll see after during the First World War and with the Russian Revolution, sort of becomes the form of socialism, because socialism, of course, creates a backlash everywhere that it exists. So Russian socialism is quite different. There's a serious split on tactics, on how we should carry out the revolution, and the Russians, since they have no recourse to parliamentary democracy whatsoever, they have no choice but to engage in a form of agitation and sort of campaign against the state, which features violence. And of course, the Russian Revolution will be a revolution with guns and weapons. That was not what Marx or the early socialists intended at all. They intended this to be a democratic transition, but the Russian experience is quite different. And political and social movements do tend to take on the character of the countries that they exist in. So movements that are trying to, organize and work in non-democratic countries tend to take on non-democratic features. We'll get back to that when we get to the Russian Revolution. In 1905, there was an attempt to overthrow the Tsar in Russia. Now, this is like the Revolution of 1848. The revolution of 1905 in Russia actually is a delayed revolution of 1848 in that it is an attempt to bring democracy to Russia. It is crushed on Bloody Sunday, January the 22nd, 1905. Tsar Nicholas II, who is the last Russian Tsar, actually orders the Russian military to fire on the workers and the petitioners who are coming to ask him for better government, better living conditions, and bread. The crowd opens fire on them, and this touches off a series of agitations against the state, which does fail. The Russian Revolution does actually fail. The Tsar promises some sort of democracy in a parliament called the Duma. The Duma is a sham. It's not really a parliament at all. So clearly Russia is teetering on the edge of collapse, and they do, of course, collapse during the First World War. So the large-scale imperialism that European nations are undertaking in this period, the unimaginable amounts of wealth which are coming in from new colonial possessions in Africa and China, the strengthening of existing imperialisms especially in Asia and Africa and India and Asia itself and the Middle East to some extent. This is really bringing an unprecedented amount of wealth. This is the high tide of European imperialism. The European powers, under the agreement dating back to the Congress of Vienna with the Quadruple Alliance, are still trying to maintain the balance of power in Europe. The entry of Germany, however, in 1871 as a nation does start to upset this. Germany is, very actively and aggressively pursuing colonial possessions and building up militaries, and all the European powers are doing this. So by the 1890s, they are starting to struggle a bit in trying to keep this peace and keep the balance of power in place. And they're also struggling, of course, to keep democratic ideas from spreading. So we see in chapter 24 some new ideas of the age, things like Darwinism, social Darwinism. Please do read this chapter. Social Darwinism actually does sort of get folded into some of these ideas of imperialism, the idea the survival of the fittest, meaning that the nations, which are the strongest, can have a right to survive and conquer sort of inferior peoples and get colonies and things like this. There is a real scientific revolution in this period, a scientific revolution of thought as well. There are new sorts of philosophies and new psychoanalysts and psychologies that come out of this period. What we are seeing here also is the birth of Zionism, a response in chapter 24 to the growing sort of ethnic or racial anti-Semitism in Europe, which also gets folded into the thoughts of the ideas of social Darwinism. The idea that Darwin's survival of the fittest can also apply to races. So some races are actually superior to others, and they can overpower and overcome other races in warfare. It's this bizarre sort of pseudo-scientific racism in Europe. The classifying people, classifying races as species. And this really does, of course, have tragic results in the Second World War with the Holocaust against the Jews. The Jews are the largest minority in Europe, and so they fall victim to this sort of racist anti-Semitism thought. There are a couple of people on page 612, Count Arthur de Gobineau, who actually does say that race is the major determinant in history. Marx, of course, believes that class conflict is the major determinant of history, but now we have these racial, pseudo-scientific, social Darwinist ideas saying that race is the determinant of human history. Houston Stewart Chamberlain is another one of these people who wrote these bestsellers in the U.S. We have, during this same period, people like Josiah Strong writing that the Anglo-Saxon race is going to take over the world and spread Christianity and capitalism because it's favored by God and our white skin proves that we're superior. These are the sort of ideas that were going around in Europe. And this sort of ethnic racism gets folded into nationalism in this bizarre sort of construct. So Zionism is actually a response to this. Theodor Herzl, who is a German Jew, actually comes up with the idea in 1896, publishes a Jewish state, saying that because of anti-Semitism, Jews in Europe are going to have no choice but to try to get their own homeland, and they want to get Palestine back. Women, of course, during this period also undertake a sort of a new feminist movement. So there are many, many ideas happening in Europe in this period. And that actually takes us up to chapter 25, which talks about the age of imperialism. So I'm approaching the class in this period in very broad sort of thematic terms, as I usually do. In the 1870s, the new imperialism in chapter 25, the imperialism of free trade, where European nations had an absolute objective to extend previous sort of imperialism, the acquisition of raw materials and markets and labor forces, to extend this into all of Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, to get raw materials, to have a guaranteed market for your goods, to bring in these large personnel cadres of sort of the British Foreign Service and things like this to directly rule these nations. So the British imperialism in India that's discussed on page 622 to 624 is absolutely the template for this kind of thing. So Western nations had this idea that inferior races, and brown people and black people and Asians cannot administer their own territories or rule their own lives. So the idea here is that it's good for them that whites come in and show them democracy and capitalism and Christianity and help them to, get civilized and rise up the ladder and eventually be able to rule themselves. The idea that we need to, if European nations need to expand their sphere of influence all over the world and keep these colonies. So the new imperialism is absolutely has a lot of economic motives behind it. These were direct political and administrative control of non-Western peoples and territories. Many Western nations are involved in this, including America to some degree. There were some settlers who went to these areas, but primarily you see colonial bureaucracies extracting the mineral wealth and resources from these nations and using, native-born workers to mine and to dig coal and diamonds and so forth. And it's also, of course, marked, as your textbook says, by cultural confidence and racial arrogance, that these people deserve to be ruled like this. So this is a period in which European nations are partitioning Africa and creating these new kingdoms and disrupting and turning people against themselves and these ideas of divide and conquer. European powers are expanding into Africa, into the Middle East, into West Africa, into the Congo. Germany and Belgium both have empires in Africa. They divide up these peoples, and they, give them new little sort of areas that they name themselves. Russia even expands to some degree into Europe.